On July 21st, 2023, as part of the National Puppetry Festival at the University of Maryland, festival attendees were invited to take a bus tour of historical Jim Henson sites in Washington, D.C. and the surrounding areas. The tour was hosted by Heather Henson and author Craig Shemin, and Cheryl Henson was also along for the tour. I recorded the audio of that bus trip in binaural audio, and I present it to you now on this episode of Under the Puppet.
You're listening to Saturday Morning Media. And now, back to our show. Welcome to the show that is preserving puppetry through the personal stories of professional puppeteers. My name is Grant Pachoco, and this is Under the Puppet.
The people in the front of the bus. Heather Henson and Cheryl Henson, who's an uncredited puppeteer. My name is Craig Shemin. I'm the president of Jim Henson Legacy, and I'll put in a plug for my book, The Salmon Friends. Also, I want to introduce Joe, who is our driver. And Joe is also a major executive with the Maryland Transportation, University of Maryland Transportation Department, but he decided to take this one personally, and he's driven the route a couple of times to make sure that it's all accessible. Thank you, Julia. Now, Theo, are you here? We will be joined by Theo, one of the student workers at the University of Maryland Transportation Department, and he was brought along to make sure that the technical stuff works. So here's what's going to happen. We're going to take a little trip around some of the area landmarks that were significant to Jim and Jane's history here in the area. I want to preface it, we had hoped to start this in front of the building, right beside the statue, and construction sort of got in the way. So imagine that the statue is right out this window. We'll have a little bit more history of that statue later on. But I hope, if you haven't already, I encourage you to go and take a picture with Jim and Kermit. And I did notice that the author of the Wimpy Kid books is also a University of Maryland alum, and they put the Wimpy Kid statue in the basement. It's still a lovely statue, but Jim and Kermit are up front. So what we're going to do in between stops, we have some pictures and video to show, and there'll be time to ask questions, and I'll be doing a lot of the talking, and Heather will pipe in from time to time when I have something wrong. I do want to caution that there's some things that we can't get close to because of construction. It seems to be construction all over the place. We'll get as close as we can to things. And then when we get to Hyattsville, to Driscoll Park, we'll stop the bus and you can get off and look at the Salmon Friends planter that's installed there and the recent signage that was installed. So I think that's, Heather, do you want to say something?
I want to say something. Hi. Hi everybody. My name is Heather Henson, as Craig said. And again, I am here, and also my sister Cheryl is right here. So two of the Henson family members can be here and pipe in and give our own personal stories. But yeah, Cheryl was born here. So, but I love this area. Washington, D.C. meant so much to my mom, and so this tour came out of because my mom continued to come back down to D.C. She loved it down here, and I often went on driving tours with her, and she would point out all the different places that she loved to visit, and the tours and the routes, and I would pester her about, like, so wait, how did that route go, and how did you get from, like, college and you made it over to the recording studio? So that's kind of where this tour, the idea of this tour came from. Because it's so cool that, Jim and Jane were right here at this university and created this stuff. So we're just bringing you through that adventure tour. And it's fun to do this with all of you. You guys are like our posse, our people, the puppet people, the Muppet fans. It's amazing to see what an influence he's had on the world, and then I do feel like you guys are like the inner circle of the truly passionate Muppet fans that really, really, really care. So it's sweet to be doing this with you, and this is like a very, for me, a personal tour of like, this is, you know, like I said, this is what I did with my mom when I would come down to DC. That's fun.
I never actually got to do those tours with my mom because I was elsewhere, but I'm so happy that Heather is sharing this with all of us, and I look forward to it. Bye.
All right, Theo, stand up and take a bow. This is Theo, University of Maryland senior. Thank you for getting the tech working. All right, Joe, I think we're ready. So while we make our way to University Park, which is where Jim grew up, let's talk a little bit about the University of Maryland. So as I said, the statue is out front. Jim enrolled here at the University of Maryland in fall of 1954. Everybody see the picture? Okay, good. Heather just wants to make sure, because we did this, well, we tested this out a few months ago.
Yeah, we did the dress rehearsal of this a month ago at a family reunion.
We didn't have Theo on that. So Jim enrolled in graphic design, which is actually in the home economics department here. Now, where we just left, the Stamp Student Union is pretty significant because Jim had set up a silkscreen apparatus. That's his silkscreen setup in the Stamp. And the building was not yet the Stamp, it was just the Student Union. It was named after Adele Stamp, who was the Dean of Women, who Jane and Jim knew back then. And when the statue was dedicated in 2004, Jane looked up at the building and said, "Oh, I knew her before she was a building." So what you're seeing there is the silkscreen poster that Jim made to advertise his silkscreen poster business. He also created the posters for a lot of University of Maryland productions, theater productions, like the Wonderful Town poster you see there. And there is the cast and crew of Wonderful Town. Now, in Jim's first semester on campus, Jim had already been working doing puppets on local television on WTOP Channel 2, or Channel 11, I think. It's a CBS, Channel 9, thank you, Joe. It was a CBS owned and operated, CBS affiliate station here. But in that first semester, Jim decided to take the puppetry class. Now, the puppetry class was a required class if you were majoring in art education, which is why this person was there. That's Jane Neville. She was a senior, majoring in art education, and she was taking that class as a requirement, and that's where they met. But as Jim got busy with work commitments, he cut back on classes a little bit and was taking basically 1 or 2 classes a semester. So it took him a little while to graduate. He graduated in 1960, and he drove to his graduation in this Rolls Royce, which he purchased with the money that he had been making doing puppets on television. Jane always liked to caution that it was a used Rolls Royce, because I guess the puppets weren't generating quite so much to get a new one. Yeah.
Okay, and so my dad often told me about that he made a lot of money right away and then burned through it. Not burned through it, but he spent it, and he often talked about how he got that adrenaline high early and realized that wasn't how you're going to be happy. So he made money and then bought the things, you know, the big luxury car, and then realized that's not what it was about. So I thought that was kind of fun, because he said it's not all about money.
Yeah, Jane had said in an interview that I was doing research for the book that one of the reasons that they got the Rolls Royce is that it had a big bench seat in the back, and that Lisa would sleep on it when they were taking trips to the puppetry festivals and stuff. Now, what we're going to be doing, we're heading to University Park, where Jim spent his school years, but he was born in Mississippi. So Heather, do you want to talk a little bit about why Jim was in Mississippi, why Jim's family was in Mississippi, and how they came back here?
Sure, because I love my ancestral information. So my dad's father was born in Oklahoma, in Meeker, Oklahoma, from a family that was a farming family, 2 generations in Oklahoma, settling that area and doing that whole thing of farming out there. And I don't remember where his undergrad was, but his grad, and he's the first generation to go to college. That whole family did. But they sent their son from Oklahoma was sent to Washington, D.C., to Maryland to get his agricultural master's. And he was doing corn and legume work. His undergrad was in corn and his grad work was in legume. Anyway, so then he was working here at the, what's it called, Beltsville, that agricultural department, because it's a big agricultural department here, and he was doing that. And then that's actually where he met his wife. It was my grandfather. He met his wife. She was a secretary of the dean of the university of the agricultural department. So she was a secretary, and that's where they met each other. And then he was stationed. He got a job with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they had a station. It was called an experimental research station down on the Delta, Mississippi Delta, because they were doing a lot of farming down there. And it was, from what I hear, it was a very nice little, you know, in the government, like, I don't know, I think they were doing more of this, but a bunch of stations, and then putting like top farmers on it, the research scientists, which is probably doing the stuff that we all are like fighting against now, like, you know, hybridizing legumes and things like that. But it was down there in Mississippi, and then it was a nice, I've gone to visit that community too. It's not at all a research station anymore now, it's just normal housing. But it was a cute little town that he got to grow up on. So he was born down there in Mississippi. So the family, Betty and Paul, moved down to Mississippi as a young couple. And they got married here. Their first child was born here. Then they moved down there, and then they had their second child there. We think so. But my dad was born in Mississippi. But so this thing about like where was Jim Henson? He was born in Mississippi, but his roots were really here because they had actually many generations living in Maryland. On my dad's mother's side, that has been in Maryland since 1850 or something, 1860. They've been down here. But his father's side of the family was agriculture and moved here because this is where the agricultural research was happening. Your top agriculture stuff. So then he was born in Mississippi on the edges of Deer Creek, and then that's when he met. There's a whole story. How are we getting to this, right? Okay.
We'll stick to
Okay.
Maryland.
Okay.
But I think it's important to note that this morning when Joe picked me up and we came on campus, there is still a farm on the University of Maryland campus. It's active agricultural school. So we are headed to University Park, Maryland, which is weird because the university is in College Park. You would think that the town would be named University Park that the university is in. But we're heading to one of the houses that Jim's family lived in on Beechwood, not Tennyson. Oh, we're going to be going to Beechwood first. So
All right, I'm just going to talk a little bit about this neighborhood, University Park. I got invited to this little town that was developed in 1936, and I think, okay. Well, it's a cute little town, and I think a lot of, employees from the university were living here, teachers and all that. 1936, it was started. My dad's mother's family were all living in Hyattsville, which we're going to go to.
Point out that those police cars are actually there for us. We are getting an escort through University Park. Joe called the chief of police, and rather than say, no, you can't drive in our land, say, we'll make sure you can get through. Because these streets were not made for a bus of this size. On your left, right here, is Beechwood Road. Wow. And you can see that's that's a picture of the period. You can tell it's a period picture because there's a TV aerial on the roof. And you can see that not much has changed. there's a picture coming up next of another picture of the house, and here's a picture of Jim when he was at high school, college age, thereabouts. This is a picture inside of Jim's parents, and Jim painted that mural, I believe. I think Karen said Jim painted that mural on the wall in the house. There's a picture of holiday meal, 1956. And here's Christmas. So this is actually the second house that they lived in. We're going to the first house second, and then the second house first. And you can see one of the neat things is on the shelf, upper right, there's an album, Songs of the Pogo, which was a Christmas present that year, and Jim used a bunch of songs from that on Sam and Friends. So I think, before the police get too mad at us, we should probably go to the next stop. So next up, we're heading to Tennyson Road, which is not too far from here.
The 75th anniversary of this town, they invited us down, and they did a whole, there was other famous people and other things in this town, so they did a whole little walking tour. But we performed a kite, we performed Celebration of Flight in one of their little outdoor areas on the 75th anniversary, and they had lots of funny stories. I don't know if I can remember them, something about a plane crashed somewhere around here. They were talking about that. But everyone lived and it landed. I don't know. But to this day, so I have on the other side of the family, my mom's side of the family, who was from California, from Needles, California. He went and worked with NASA, and then he ended up living here too. And so we still have family members, cousins that are living in this neighborhood in University Park. Kind of fun. Actually, two of them. So my cousin and then my cousin's kid still here.
When we did the test run of this, we were in a 20-passenger van, and we were followed by one of Heather's cousins in a car. And every time we stopped in this area, he would get out of the car and go up to the house and knock on it and say, "Do you know Jim Henson used to live here?" And they knew, because I think somebody,
They said yes. We cursed him for putting the bamboo in the backyard. My grandfather planted that bamboo. He planted that bamboo in the backyard, and it just continues to grow and grow and grow, and we can't get rid of it.
That's what we saw.
Yeah. It's really hard to get it to
I was
go
really happy
out.
to build puppets with it. I was like, I'm gonna harvest that bamboo.
Make a raft with that much bamboo.
But he had a beautiful garden, my grandfather, and we always heard about that. He loved to tend his roses and his flowers, and his birds. He always had a bird feeder and would know all his birds and know all his flowers.
All right, coming up on your left, another thing on your left is Tennyson Road.
Which house?
Kermit's there to greet us. Okay, now here's a picture. Everybody keep your awes to one audible awe. And there's Jim on those very steps. As I said, this was before the first house we just saw. But you can see that not a lot has changed. So I think we are going to prevent the police, the nice chief of police, from having too much of a heart attack, and we can proceed and not block the road any further. But what's amazing is that neither of those two houses have really changed that much. So as we leave University Park, we will be heading into Hyattsville. Everything's pretty close together, as you can see. Yeah, so once we get across this stop sign, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Hyattsville, Maryland. So here we are at Northwestern High School. Now, right to your right, and we are right in front of the Jim Henson School of Arts, Media, and Communications. It's actually now the Jim Henson Academy, I think they call it. This is the high school that Jim went to, but it isn't, because only the auditorium remained of that era. They rebuilt the school in 2000. So Jim attended this school between 1951 and 1954. Jim spent a lot of time in that auditorium that did survive. And when Jim passed away, Jane Henson received a lot of requests for people who wanted to honor Jim, name things, and this was the only one that she granted because it was such a strong connection to the school. And Jane was very close with Leona Lowry, who was the head of that part of the school for many years. She just retired, but there were, Jane was very generous and funded a lot of the arts efforts there and helped them out all the time. And there's some nice displays inside. And this is a very active school in Prince George County for arts and media. And one of the fun things about the school that was here, Joe Irwin, who went to school with Jim, and he still lives not far from here. We saw him a couple of months ago. He remembered being on the tennis team with Jim, and they would have to do laps around the school. And he and Jim both sort of cut through the school to shave some time off their laps. And I think that was the only time that Jim Henson ever cut corners. Thank you very much. It's material like this that you can depend on for the rest of the tour. So Jim was very active in school arts, did a lot of stuff for the magazine. In fact, a comic strip that he did for the one of the school publications, Pierre, the French Rat, became the basis for his first puppet, even before Kermit. Here is Jim in the yearbook, as he was known, Jimmy. Now, there's a notation, Les Petites Players. That was the school's puppet club. But Jim was not a puppeteer in it. He built sets, from what we know. And here's a picture of Jim working with the drama students. You can see him in the plaid flannel shirt. That is, I don't know if that's the location of the tennis court then, but this was a relatively close place to Jim's, the first house we saw, and Jim would ride his bike to school. He and Joe Irwin would ride together. They lived nearby. All right, I think, Joe, we're ready to go on to the next stop. So we're approaching the District of Columbia, and our next stop on the tour concerns what Jane was doing. She was a few years ahead of Jim. She graduated and was all set to do student teaching, and she was going to accept a position to be a teacher. She was doing student teaching already. And Jim kept on asking her, well, just stay for the summer, and they had been doing Salmon Friends by then, and we'll see what happens. And Jim kept on asking her to stay with him and keep working, and Jane decided to go to graduate school, and she enrolled in Catholic University. We'll be seeing it a little bit, but Jane and a roommate got an apartment near Catholic University, and that's where we're going to be driving by in just a minute. And it was located almost directly between Jim's parents' house in University Park, and the Channel 4 studio. So Jim would leave University Park, stop off in the district, pick up Jane, and go over to do the show. And for a time, there were 2 shows a night, so they would have to come back. Jane said, they would go out for dinner. They would go to a Hot Shops restaurant. It was very popular. It was a Marriott chain, a nice little sit-down place where you could get a burger and a milkshake. And then they'd have to come back for the second show. And Jane stayed in that apartment, or there were a couple of different apartments that she lived in up until they got married. And we found out the address on this one because it was printed on the marriage license.
That was one of the questions I can't remember what Mom's answer was, but I was wondering, how did they do 2 shows? It was a 6 o'clock and an 11 o'clock. So what did they do between those times? Did they go go all the way back. Yeah, and I don't think they had as much traffic then as they do now. Like now, it's so much traffic to go back.
Jim told a reporter that he forgot that he didn't make it. He almost didn't make it back in time for the second show because it's easy to forget when you're out having a good time. And Jane told me a similar story, that she was out and she realized that she actually did forget it. And Jim, she called up the station. It's like, oh, I'm sorry I missed it. And he's like, oh, it's no problem. And he said, I always keep one to do in case, alone if I have to. And I think it was because, then I found that article where Jim said that he almost missed it himself. And I think that's why he didn't really, it didn't bother him if Jane missed it, because he almost did it himself. But yeah, they just have to kill time between. And sometimes they did spend it working, because when they moved studios, you'll see the location of the first one, which was in the basement of a hotel. But once they got to the actual studio that NBC built, they had their own little cubicle. So they had a place to work between shows. And then later on, they had a place in the Rodell studio in Georgetown. They had a little loft studio space. So sometimes they were working on getting the second show ready. But usually one of the shows, when they were doing two shows, one was one that they had already done before. So they would sort of do a new one, and then it would, if it worked well, the new one would then be cycled into the repertoire.
In the beginning, they just schlep all this stuff. Right?
Yeah. Jim built everything in his room at home, and he actually, Yeah, they had a Thunderbird. He had the Thunderbird, I think, when he was starting in high school. But he had a literal basket. Okay. We are almost in the District of Columbia. We don't get a police escort here, though, right? We hope we don't.
And I understand Bobby said that because the Aunt Bobby who played piano, that I also think that Ralph the dog was modeled after a lot. Because that's exactly when when Bobby would play piano, she would play it and then she would turn, literally, she'd play piano, be, really excited about it, and then turn around and tell some really funny jokes, in the middle of the song, and then go back to playing piano. And it really felt like she was Ralph the dog. I was like, I don't know, it's just such great humor. But from my understanding, that she would play at the radio station, at the local radio station. So I always assumed that was the same television station when radio stations turned into television stations. So it is fun to think about. You're asking me what the crafting in those houses, and it was in that second house we saw, the first house we saw, that was the second house they lived in. That's where Kermit was created. And then it was his mother, as everyone knows this. I mean, I'm assuming you guys all know the basics. So, but my dad made Kermit from his mother's old green coat, because those fleece kind of pastel jackets were very popular at the time. It wasn't green. Yeah, and those pastel colors. I think there was other shades. Anyway, so that fabric was kind of new and ready. But it was in the recycling, the bin of fabrics. And it's just so fun to think that happened right there. And that he was making puppets, as we were saying, in high school. And then in college. Anyway, it's just nice that this all happened right here. That's what we're here to see.
When he first started making the puppets, though, he was following what he read in the library book, which was people who had essentially done puppets for theater, for puppet theater. So the very first puppets he made were sort of hard-to-surface puppets meant to be seen far away. And as Jim started working in television and he got a sense of what would work up close, he started working with more softer materials. And that's really where Kermit and Harry came about. And I should mention, if you have a chance to go to the National Museum of American History, the first Kermit, as well as Harry and Sam, are part of the new permanent exhibition, Entertainment Nation. And they have their rightful home right next to Dorothy's ruby red slippers, and R2-D2 and C-3PO, and Edgar Berg. Edgar Berg is not there, but Charlie McCarthy is.
It meant a lot to my mom, who had spent a lot of time on that museum row and going all the Smithsonian museums, that Sam and friends who had been born here and created here would stay here in DC. And it's really lovely to go to see that exhibit. It is so beautiful the way they honor Kermit. And it's a beautiful exhibit the way they tell a story about pop culture and how it forms America. It's really interesting. It's a good exhibit, and it's a huge honor to have it there in such a place of honor in American history.
And they have more puppets in the collection, the rest of the Sam and Friends cast, and then about 20 or so other characters, and they'll rotate into the exhibition as they want to give the other puppets a rest so they're not exposed to the light and all of those other elements. Oh yes, while you're in the area, if you're not going on Sunday, but if you're still in the area, Baltimore is hosting the touring version of a permanent exhibit that we have at the Museum of the Moving Image. So also, if you're in the New York area, come see the permanent Henson exhibition called the Jim Henson Exhibition at the Museum of the Moving Image. And the largest is at the Center for Puppetry Arts in Atlanta. All right, now we're on Perry Street. We won't be able to stop very long, but on your right, one of these brick buildings, and this one right here on the end, is the apartment building where Jane lived while she was going to Catholic University. So we don't know what floor or what apartment it was, but that's pretty much where it is. We won't be able to dawdle too long here, but you can get a nice look at it. So this is where Jim would pull over and pick up Jane and move on to where our next stop is. Now, while Jane was living there, as long as I knew Jane, she always sort of shied out of the public spotlight and always deflected it to Jim. But there were a lot of little interviews that took place during the Sam and Friends era, because the whole idea of being a young woman working on television or sharing a television show with Jim Henson or with anybody was a very novel idea. So there would be some interviews with Jim and Jane together, some with Jane. There was like a little blurb of Jane mentioned in Glamour magazine at one point. And and it was always interesting to me that Jane's roommate didn't really watch the show because they didn't have a television, which was not uncommon. When Sam and Friends started, there were literally only, I think, 40,000 sets in the DC area, and then it went to millions by the time it ended. So you'll be able to see just how close that Perry Street apartment was to Catholic University. It's over there on the right, as we're going to be passing it over the bridge, I think. So Jane, Heather, you want to talk a little bit, or Cheryl, want to talk a little bit about Jane returning to Catholic University later on, because she was a very passionate, and this is where she was also the studio assistant to the artist, right?
Yeah, it's kind of very honored.
Art here. I do that. Okay, so my mom was getting her grad degree at Catholic University in fine art. She really loved liturgical art. She loved, and I do think this ties into Muppets and puppetry, but she loved religious art, liturgical art. She loved her teachers here, and I forget his name, but she loved making little figures, and I think this was like a key piece about her connection to puppetry. She loved the power of the little figures of the creche, and so that was her master thesis project, was to make a creche set, and she loved the power of that, which was interesting because then that later Anyway, she also loved the art of working in ceramics and clay, and she was living in that apartment when they were digging out the shrine room, right? And they were digging deep into the earth to make the what do you call it? The lower, what's it called? The grotto or something like that. Anyways, it was way in below, and then she was getting some of the clay, and when they were building the foundation for the cathedral, the side thing for the cathedral, and using that, going into the construction site and gathering the earth to then make her fresh figures. I believe there may have been, like, I don't know if this is true, but I think that it was on the foundation of an old church, and there may have been human remains in some of that clay that she was digging up. I'm not really sure. That was anyway, there was some talk about that. But she loved this, using this powerful dirt and clay that was from a foundation to build the shrine, and then putting those into the figures of these precious, or these crushed figures. So we still have some of those figurines. She made a maquette, smaller version of it, and then she was going to build a bigger version. So we have some pieces. Some of them have still remained.
Heather, I would just add, you mentioned she re-enrolled at the university here at Catholic U in the 80s. She re-enrolled, took classes, and I came down here with her and stayed for a few days, and her joy and just love of being here and with the professors, it was really very special.
Yeah, because so later in life, after, I like to say after I went to art school, I think it may have started kicking in, I'm not sure. But she, later in life, after I had graduated from RISD, then she decided to come back to her art school, and her professor that she had been studying under was still here. And he was in his last years, and that was a beautiful thing. And that's the person's name I can't remember. But it was really cool that she was able to study with him again. And then she loved her teachers here, and it meant a lot for her to come back and do that studying again. One of the stories that they could have put her in the dorms, and then she decided to, but it seemed a little odd. She was much older than the young students. So she went to go stay with the nuns. There was another place where the nuns were staying. She took a room with the nuns, and that was really sweet. But she loved that liturgical art. That we did our shop. Yeah, so I was encouraging, because she so encouraged people to do their artwork. She encouraged her husband to do the artwork. She encouraged all of us. She encouraged me. She nurtured like no one's business. But she really loved. She absolutely, sincerely loved seeing people's creativity come to fruition. And she did that at the O'Neill. And so I then encouraged her. I loved these little crush figures that she was making, and her figurines. And so she made a nativity show. We encouraged her to continue, like, to take her nativity figures and actually turn them into puppets and make a story with these figures. So we worked on that at the O'Neill one year. We just put her through the program of the O'Neill, and we worked with Sean Cohen, because he was a good writer and very Catholic writer, and Stefano, who was a really cool builder, and Ron Binion helped in on it, and kind of the whole O'Neill helped us build those puppets. And then eventually we actually then worked with the Jim Henson company and had the puppets more refined and built. And then we worked on that and developed it actually in Orlando. We brought it down to Orlando, put it up in some of the churches there. And then eventually, then when my mom passed away, then Cheryl, you want to talk about how it got to the television? Because you know more of the story. Yeah, then it got on TV.
So one of our friends, Father Eric Andrews, who started, I believe, as an intern from Hunter, working with David Gumpel in the video studio. And he worked in the video studio with Craig, and he worked on a number of different productions. And he decided to go back to seminary and become a Paulist brother, and then was the head of production for the Paulists. And so when my mother passed away, he was very kind and very close to my mom, and he gave the sermon, the eulogy, at my mom's funeral service. And coincidentally, he happened to get an opportunity to produce a 1-hour commercial-free Christmas special, religious Christmas special for CBS that would be aired on the national CBS, which is really unheard of to get a commercial-free hour. And so we had been chatting about Mom's Nativity puppet show, and we're one of the first calls he made, and he said, "You guys want to mount that Nativity puppet show?" And my mom had just passed away, and it just felt so completely meant to be. So we all rallied, and Heather did her beautiful kites as part of the service. But it was a really beautiful, beautiful 1 hour piece. Excuse me? Regis Philbin narrated it, and it also included beautiful speeches from a number of different, because the Nativity Puppet Show is actually a total of about 12 minutes. And so but it was just gorgeous music. It's a beautiful special. Oh, there are DVDs in the shop, yes!
So our next stop is going to take us to a hotel. And it is more than a hotel because it's a huge hotel that just got a lot smaller. And it's one of the reasons that we can't get as close to it as we got 2 months ago, because they've been tearing down parts of it. But the part that we're going to be able to see from the street is the tower, the Wardman Tower, which is a landmark. And it was the first home of WRC-TV. And back in the day, this was a huge resort hotel, and a lot of hotels had auditoriums. And when WRC started, they took over that sort of auditorium area, and that's where they broadcast their shows. But they only had that one studio, and they would just sort of point the cameras at the various parts of it, various corners. One of the people I should point out that worked with Jim at Wardman Park was a young radio personality and television personality who was playing Bozo the Clown, and his name was Willard Scott. As Willard used to always say, he's not just any clown, he's Bozo. But Willard was always a very, very good friend of the Henson legacy and of Jane's. And when you'll see later on, we should talk about the statue. Willard was the master of ceremonies when the statue at Maryland was unveiled. And when the Jim Henson The Works book came out, Willard made sure that he anchored, because he would do the weather report from either Virginia or Washington, because he lived down here, so they would do a remote cut-in for several days a week. And he made sure on the day that we were doing a Today Show appearance about the Jim Henson Works book, he arranged for his weather cut-in to be done at the Wardman Park, so he could talk about the history with Jim. Now, the hotel just was an amazing thing if you wanted to look up more information about the hotel, because it had its own, stores. It had a deli, it had a drugstore, it had dry cleaners, everything. It was like a little self-contained city. Willard Scott was on the radio for many years as part of a team called the Joy Boys, which was kind of like, if anybody's heard of Bob and Ray, it was sort of like this area's Bob and Ray. And Eddie Walker, who was Willard's partner on the Joy Boys, would help Jim and Jane pick the music for Sam and Friends, because he had an almost encyclopedic memory for songs, because Eddie Walker was blind. So he remembered songs and couldn't really write down. He just had to remember a lot of information because he would be playing them as a disc jockey. So Jane would tell me that Eddie would always say, "Hey, listen, have you heard this song? This song just came out." He would always know the new things that are coming out. Him and a man named Lou Benelli, who was the WRC music librarian, would work with Jim and Jane to pick music, because it wasn't enough to just pick a good song. It had to be right for Sam and Friends. So it had to either be a specific comedy recording, like Stan Freberg, or it had to be, they would take a standard that they could put a comedic twist on, like Rosemary Clooney's "I've Grown Accustomed to Your Face," or something of that nature. Yeah, they had access to, because there was a TV station and a radio station, they had access to any record that they wanted to, and they only had to log it as if they were playing it on the radio. They didn't really have to get permission, or at least they didn't think they had to. Stan Freberg later was a little annoyed until he saw them working and then said, "I love this, you can use it." But yeah, they just would log it in the logbook.
It's so different than today. You know, we're dealing with copyrights, and you know, like you put any music on your puppet film on Facebook, it comes down, or on YouTube, and it comes down immediately. You know, you can't. It's so you know, you cannot. We're all it's important to not use other people's music. But anyway, at the time that's not how they were creating their material, or definitely just pulling. They were just lip syncing to popular songs, and as Craig was saying, not just popular songs, but it was more like they had to be very particular recordings that they were looking for. I just think it's fascinating, this whole evolution of like from the radio station, the importance of, because as you know, or maybe you don't know, that Jim was, of course, loved radio and listened to a lot of those radio shows growing up. And I love Stan Freberg's material is brilliant. It's really good, and it's interesting. Have you guys all listened to Stan Freberg or know who he is? Oh, wow. So wait, only one person on the bus knows Stan Freberg? Okay. All right. So, all right, a bunch of you. It feels a little funny now because I feel like, wow, my dad really used a lot of his material, a lot, in the development of the Muppets and the humor of the Muppets. And I think he did credit it at some point. He did say it, but
There's no record of it except in a mention in a newspaper article, but Stan Freberg did make an appearance on Sam and Friends. And the way it's remembered, and Grant Pachoco is on the bus somewhere, I think. Grant, are you here? Yeah.
I'm here.
Grant was able to interview Stan, and Stan basically explained that the bit involved Stan popping into frame asking the Muppets, telling them that he was upset that he wasn't getting credit. And they said, "Oh, you want credit? Here's credit." And they took out a mallet and hit him on the head. Yeah, it's online. We interviewed Stan Freberg talking about the Muppets.
No, I mean that's basically the story. And then I had sent that to Karen Falk, and Karen Falk sent a copy of the telegram that Stan sent afterwards, like, "Oh, it was so great to meet you," and which I think is in Craig's book as well.
It is in my book,
yeah.
Which is available both in softcover and hardcover at bearmanormedia.com or at the Puppetry Store, where there's a discount. Okay, folks, coming up on the right is the Workman Park Hotel. You'll see it coming up. This is 2900 block. It's 2600 block. When Jim and Jane were working here, it was the Sheridan Park Hotel.
No.
So you can tell just from the trip to get here, coming back and forth and coming multiple times a day, it's a lot of driving in this area. Here we go. You can see it up on the right-hand side, that huge building coming up on the corner. That's the Workman Park.
Wow.
And it had been sort of built out to other buildings, which have since been torn down. This was most recently just a couple of months ago. Right, Joe? Yeah. So somewhere deep in the lower floors was the first home of WRC-TV. Yeah, for people on the other side, you'll get to see it because we're going to be let's turn this bus around, Joe. And after we do the return and see it on the other side, I'll give you a chance. This is what it looked like at that period of time. You can see the beautiful vintage cars, the drugstore on the corner,
So much cleaner.
and here is the studio inside. That was the Circle 4 Ranch, which was one of the first shows Jim worked on. He created characters named Longhorn and Shorthorn. And sadly, no film of that exists. Okay, if you look on the left, thank you, Joe. Here's another great angle of it's a beautiful building. Well, yeah, because it was never, back then, television studios were just sort of any place they could find a place. They were operating television stations out of houses.
I'm going to stick my nose in this story about the Wardman Park Hotel. If you ever see the movie Advise and Consent, it was made in 1962, and it's an interesting movie about the inner workings of Congress. One of the opening scenes is filmed at that location with Walter Pidgeon, and it's a classic black and white movie, but that scene is iconic. It's as you're pulling up the main driveway. So if you get a chance, it's absolutely worth looking at. That hotel was very old school, very elegant. It was where the power people met and stayed, a lot of members of Congress. The I don't know which vice president it was, but for Franklin Roosevelt actually lived there as well. A lot of senators and congressmen called that their residence while Congress was in session. So it's worth looking up, and if you see that movie, Advise and Consent, that's right in the beginning of the movie.
He was only on 5 minutes a night, but they would still be on the cover of the WRC program schedule. They got a lot of... Well, the first person to put him on nationally was Steve Allen on the Tonight Show. And it wasn't until they did Ed Sullivan, but not until they went to New York and they sort of got in that variety show circuit. But yeah, Steve Allen heard about it because WRC was a network owned and operated show. So they could, people up in New York at NBC could see what was happening on the local feeds here. And that word spread. And once they did the Tonight Show, and then they did Steve Allen's Sunday night variety show a few weeks later, and then after that they started doing other national shows. The commercials are written by the ad agency, but they worked with Jim on it. I think they knew what the sensibility of the show was. There was a man named Tom Shaw that wrote a lot of the commercials, and he, that was one of his jobs, and he'd go and deliver a stack commercial. But they knew what the show was like, and they knew what the characters were. And it was originally the Muppets didn't speak; they only sang. And the TV station, I go into detail in my book. Have I mentioned there's a book? But WRC. I don't know. Maybe if enough people ask. But no, there was the station paired him up with a guy named Paul Arnold, who was a folk singer, and the station said, "Oh, we'll give the Muppets this guy who could sort of talk and do voices for the Muppets and do commercials." Yeah. Oh, good. On the left, we can't get very close, but if you look up to the left, that big tower, that is the Channel 4, the second home of Channel 4 on Nebraska Avenue. It's a TV studio that was actually built for television. And unfortunately, I had breakfast with my contacts at WRC yesterday. They're doing construction too. But Studio A, where Sam and Friends was still there. Sam and Friends is in the same studio. Here's the entrance to you can't really see it from here, but if you look right on your left, there's the entrance to Channel 4. And the building is being altered a little bit on the inside. It still looks the same on the outside. And Studio A was not only home to Sam and Friends, but it was home to Meet the Press. And it was home to one of the Kennedy-Nixon debates was done out of that studio. And the day they did that, they had to kick Sam and Friends down the hall to the other studio And the whole story of that episode of Sam and Friends was that the debate was happening, and that people were coming in to take equipment out for the debate while the Sam and Friends broadcast was trying to continue. Okay, we're going to go around the circle, and the other side of the bus will be able to see it. There are a couple of shots of Jim. We have some photos of Jim and Jane at work. If you'll notice, they're kneeling because at that point yet, they had a fixed height to the camera. It was locked off at like 5. Jane remembered very clearly. It was 5'6". That was as high as the camera could ever go. So they were usually performing on their knees. Here's another shot. And if you look at the baby in the stroller, that's Lisa. What's wonderful is that everybody at WRC loved working with Jim, because everything else at that station was news, essentially. So when they would do stuff, it was their turn to play and actually try new things. And a very nice lady came up to me when I did a book signing in Baltimore, and it was Carl Deegan's wife, and Carl was the director of Sam and Friends and Meet the Press. And she told me how much she loved working with Jim because they just had a great time. They were able to experiment with the new technology that they wouldn't have a chance to do. So, like I said earlier, when they got to this studio, this new studio, they had their own little cubicle, which they called Weirdsville. And there are Jim and Jane working in Weirdsville, and they would work out the routines in front of a mirror in the Weirdsville cubicle because access to the TV camera was very limited. It was, because they were usually broadcasting a TV show. And it was in the newsroom. There was a little cubicle next to where Tippy Stringer, the weather person, had her cubicle next door. And here, we mentioned Bobby Payne. There's Bobby working with Jane. And it's a pretty significant part of the story that Jim decided that he and Joe Irwin, they were going to go off to Europe for a little summer vacation in the summer of 1958. And the station, at that time, Sam and Friends didn't take the summer off. Later on, they would take summer hiatus. But the station did not want the show to go off the air. There's the Step Channel 4 entrance right on the right. Joe, you're the best. You can't really, this building is really beautiful. It's in there. If you, there's a picture of it in the book. Have I mentioned there's a book? So in order to appease the executives at the station, Jim, they had to keep the show going. So Jim asked Jane to keep the show going in his absence, but she couldn't do it alone. So he enlisted a friend, Heather Henson, friend from school, Bob Payne. So together, Jane and Bob Payne kept the show on for the summer and had a really good time doing it. I interviewed Bob for the book, and he just had only wonderful memories of that time. And they spent most of it laughing, he said. And when Jim came back, the show was still around, and that's when Jim came back after seeing puppet theater in Europe and seeing how seriously puppets were regarded in Europe. And he decided to make to keep the Muppets going and sort of make a career out of it. And it would on that fall of 1958 is when they incorporated Muppets Incorporated. And on the same day they incorporated, Jim started recording the audio of every episode of Sam and Friends for a while. So there are audio recordings of more than 400 episodes. No, it was still, even if it was a record, they would record the audio, but it was just Jim wanted to preserve the broadcasts. So some of the recordings were, original things, and some were records.
More like I need an interview about it. I think it's fascinating, the music and the recordings that they were doing, because I've always been curious about the voices. So they started just taking off the shelf recordings, but then they started making their own. But Dad would, oh, okay, because someone had mentioned like a live baby or a baby in live television, but it was always pre-recorded.
The baby could be there because the audio was all pre-recorded, even when Jim started doing the dialogue himself. So Paul Arnold, like I said, he was the guy the station hired. Let's put him with the Muppets. I don't think Jim liked that so much, but he was not yet doing voices himself. And that's when the Wilkins Coffee Company came in and asked, they had seen the SK commercials, they said, oh, maybe Muppets can do commercials. So Jim started using his voice on the Wilkins Coffee commercials, and from there, he brought his voice into doing Sam and Friends and the SK commercials, and shortly thereafter, Paul Arnold left the station, and the Muppets were back to just being the Muppets. So yeah, but they continued to do records and lip sync to records, but sometimes they would have spoken introductions because they had to get the show to a certain length, and sometimes they would do full sketches. And I've just been working on, we're going to do a follow-up to the first book, and it's going to be a Sam and Friends script book. The nice people, the nice people at Henson family and company are giving me the approval to do a compilation of Sam and Friends scripts that you'll be able to read. But enough about the book.
Oh, you know all the dates. You're better about the dates. So on the personal side of the story of while this is happening, so my dad was engaged to Ann Hood who was I think a very, I don't know, I have no idea, but we were told that, we were told a cheerleader type girl, sorority girl, cheerleader girl. He was dating her and engaged to her, but they were working together, and my mom was actually engaged to someone else, I forget his name. Anyway, so it was a platonic, it started as a platonic relationship, and in fact, as you can see, my mom was the senior in college, and this little freshman kid comes in. And from what I understand, that my dad, when he entered that puppet class, he hired the best person in the class to work with him on the show. So that was my mom. But my mom was dating someone else, and then how many years did they work together before they? It was. Yeah. And then, so, after they were working together, and then I guess there was definitely a moment that they decided that they wanted to be with each other than their other partners, and they had to both let go of their fiancés, and then, but that's when that big break happened, that my dad, they kind of decided to take a big break, and he went to Germany, and he traveled with his best friend Paul Irwin to Europe, and traveled around and took that break away from the company and away from his fiance and the world. And then that's when he came back, and he decided that he really wanted to that's when he decided to come back, and he wanted to marry my mom, and said, because he broke up with his girlfriend, his fiance before that, and he came back and he's like, I want to be with you. And then that's all when he decided he wanted to also do the company, and he wanted to bring the company to, is that when he also said, no, yeah, incorporate the company and continue on.
And that's when it sort of went from being a part-time college job to being something that we continue with. What we have next up, the picture that you're looking at now is Jim getting his first Emmy from a man named Richard Nixon.
What?
Richard Nixon was the vice president at the time, and when this is a photo op after, but during the presentation, Richard Nixon was saying something to Jim, and then Jim came back to the seat, and Jane asked what Nixon had said, and Jim told Jane that Nixon had told him I knew a man in the Navy with a beard. That was pretty much it. So a few years, and I was going to say a few years ago, but back in the mid '90s, Jane returned to WRC. So you'll be able to see what it looks like from inside the cage in here. I think so. I think that they were having fun with it. At that time, both he and Stan Freberg were doing a lot of commercials that would poke fun at products. I remember there was a radio campaign. CBS hired Stan Freberg to do a radio campaign for their upcoming season, and one of the new shows was Hogan's Heroes. And Stan Freberg came up with the slogan, if you liked World War II, you'll love Hogan's Heroes. So they shot those commercials at Rodell Studio, which was run by Fritz Roland and Dell Ankers. And Dell was the cinematographer on all those commercials. And what was amazing, his family just uncovered like a stack of 200 still pictures that they donated to the Henson Archives. Karen Falk just found it. So wonderful stuff.
He's a beautiful cinematographer, and that was one of the places my mom did bring me down to that place. So when I see that cobblestone, I'm like, yes, I think that is there, because it's all cobblestone down there. It's a beautiful studio, and he's an amazing photographer, and he took all those beautiful behind-the-scenes pictures, but all those shots, and he said they continued to work with him, even though they moved back to New York. When they moved to New York, they would come down here and continue to work with him. So anyway, he's nothing like a good cinematographer for puppets.
And what you're looking at now is the second floor of the Dell Ankers studio of Rodell. Jim and Jane rented that second floor space so they could have a place to store all the sets for the Wilkins commercials, as well as work on new things. So it was just a big empty space, and you can see Jane working over near the window. Wow. And then, like I said, they continue to work there in the 60s, because we know this is the 60s because there's Frank Oz right in the middle with hair, and Jerry Jewell all the way on the left. And Don Saline is on the right. And this was sort of the Muppet team that was working together in that mid-60s period. He came in at like 62 or so, because the first thing he did was Rolf.
Yeah, so puppet people, Don Saline was a major puppet connection that my dad had hired. He was an amazing puppet builder. He was already an established puppet builder. I thought, so that I guess I'd gotten the story wrong in my head, because I thought he met Don Saline when he moved to New York and moved into the building where Bert Hillstrom lived. But that wouldn't make sense because he's already here. But that picture was here. Oh, that's when they came down. Oh, that's how that all worked out. Okay. So you understand that they were living when Don Saline. So again, my parents moved to New York to make it big in New York City, because they wanted to move, go to get rich and famous. For the rich and famous contract, they were trying to make it big. And when they moved to New York City, they moved into I forget the name of the building, but the Beacon Place, because that's where Bert Hillstrom was living. And Bert Hillstrom, as you know, was Kukla, Fran, and Ollie, but he normally lives in Chicago. But he was in New York City because he was doing a show on Broadway. So he was only living there temporarily. But he was living there and working, and Don Saline was his puppet builder that he was working with. And I thought that's how he met him. Yeah, so then maybe he then worked with Don Saline, brought him into his company in New York. Because, so where is Don Saline from? He's from Connecticut, right? Isn't he from? Because that's that whole thing. Yeah, he was doing stop motion animation in George Powell. And he made that marionette. No, I'm sorry. Richard Termini will know about Don Saline. So there's a Don Saline, there's a marionette up in New London at UConn. so it's from Don Sling. So Don Sling's family is somehow from Connecticut. Yeah, so they moved to New York City in 1963. So that's when he met Don Sling, and then they continued again. They continued to come down here to Rodell Studios to film things.
What I'm going to show you is often when they were doing a campaign for an advertiser, they would do a sales film to show to the sales executives or the internal executives of the company. And it was sort of always done as a little tongue-in-cheek humor piece because it was never meant to be seen by the public. So we have one that was done for Wilson's Meats, I believe we're going to see. And this will show you Rodell Studio and give you a sort of tongue-in-cheek look at the production process.
It's interesting that they had moved the whole company to New York City, but they were still coming down here to shoot. But I think it's because Bell Anchor's space. I mean, that is beautifully shot. He was a great cinematographer, and they had that space. And the difference when they were, because they did go to New York to kind of make it big, to get rich and famous. And when they were down here in DC, you know, a lot of that, they also had a studio. My parents had a studio in the basement of their house, too, which was in Echo Park. Not Echo Park, right? But anyway, further away. Out of Maryland, outside. Where they had their house. Bethesda. They had a studio. Oh, okay.
No, so you see a picture of Jim and Jane. Jane said that Jim's mother did not want him to have the beard when they got married. So Jim shaved it off and sent the clippings to Jane with a little note that said something like, "From Samson to Delilah." They were married in Maryland, in Salisbury, which is a whole on the other side of the state, but that's where Jane's family was from. And when they got married and they got a house in Bethesda, which we are not going to, mostly because the house is no longer there, sadly. It's a lovely house. We have a nice picture of it. You can see Jane on the little balcony there, and it looks like Jim's Thunderbird is parked in the driveway. And it's a beautiful sort of mid-century modern house. There's Jim and Jane's first Christmas. And Jim with George Washington. Now, Joe had pointed out at some point we passed where you could see the Washington Monument from where we were driving, and everyone knows that's a monument to this cat. Jim and Jane did a lot of work in the house, and the ground floor was sort of the workspace area, and the second floor was the living area. And Jim actually brought in, and so soon after they moved in, Jim bought a second-hand animation stand and put it in the house, and that's where he would do his animation work. And Jane said that he would do it mostly at night, so he wouldn't be disturbed during the day with people calling and having to do other things. So he would sort of work through the night doing animation. And you can see from the surface, usually he would either be painting under the camera or moving little tiny pieces of paper. And that is Lisa, who's one of the first additions of the family. Now, one of the fun things about the house in Bethesda is when I was doing all this research, we found an account from someone that was doing research about landmarks, and the house in Bethesda was part of this subdivision that was targeted at young professionals in the Washington area, people that were working for government and attorneys and stuff. But the person who was selling these houses documented in an interview that she remembered very clearly Jim and Jane coming and shopping for the house. And the reason she remembered it is that they were both wearing shorts, which apparently wasn't done. In 1960 in the Washington area, if you're going house shopping, you were going to dress up. So they saw this couple wearing shorts and looking around, and they did not take them seriously. And they didn't think that they were really interested in buying the house. But she remembered not only were they interested, but they ended up buying the house and paying cash because all of the Wilkins commercials had given them a nice little savings. Just a few other Maryland sites to mention. Also in Bethesda, the National Institutes of Health, they did a bunch of benefit performances for various fundraising efforts at the National Institute for Health. And there's Jane with Kermit and Sam with some of the NIH people. And Jim was an artist who also liked to exhibit his art, and this was an art show in Baltimore that he brought his silk screens and other works to. I was thinking, I wonder if people who went to that still have their original Jim Henson, and they bought it from this college kid. We want to mention that Jim was very active in Puppeteers of America, and he was president of Puppeteers of America for a while, and he met the first puppetry festival they went to, I think, was Detroit. Does that sound right, Cheryl? Because that's where they met Burr. Yeah, because it was the summertime. Because it was also, they went to Detroit, but Burr had a thing after that they went with Burr to. He had like a summer teaching thing at another place. So it was right after the festival, wasn't part of it. And then the following year, they went to Sylmar, California. And that's where they met Jerry Jewell and Frank Oz. And everyone was very big on Frank Oz, who was a very talented person, and Jim was very interested in working with him, but Frank had not yet graduated from high school. So he hired Jerry Jewell to come back and work with him on Sam and Friends, and that was 1961. Okay, Frank's parents, Francis and Mike, right? Osnowitz, and Frank is also Osnowitz. But they were very active in the puppetry community in Northern California, and had their own company. And Frank and Jerry actually worked together during the summer. What was the troupe that did the puppets out? There was a puppet troupe that did like park performances. Fairyland Theater. Yeah. So the creator of that troupe had retired, and temporarily Jerry was in charge. So Jerry and Frank spent the summer doing that. It was the summer right before, or the summer of the festival. So that's why they were doing a lot of stuff together. And Jerry was hired to come and work on Sam and Friends, and then, as luck would have it, they come back to Washington, and Sam and Friends gets canceled. So Sam and Friends, Jerry worked on the last 13 weeks of Sam and Friends. There are a few scripts that he wrote, but he was also performing with them. But he started doing a lot of he would do all the other commercials, and Jerry described the experiences. He would, type out statements and sweep the floors and do whatever, whatever was asked. But he really developed a passion for writing with Jim during that time. So when they went back when they decided to move to New York, Jerry went with them, and they spent that period. And by the time they moved to New York, Frank had graduated from high school, and he had gone into college, community college, for a little bit. He had wanted to become a journalist, and but Jim called him and said, "You want to move to New York?" And since his parents knew Jim and Jane, they were confident in letting their kid go across the country. And that's what happened, and that's how Frank's relationship. But Jim was president of the P of A in 1960-something. 1967. And Hurleyville in 1963. The next place we're going to be visiting is So we're heading to Hyatt's. Well,
Puppetry and the Mike Osnowitz puppets. There's a nice article, and if you look it up, because when we had the exhibit for Jim Henson in San Francisco, they did a sidebar exhibit on Mike and Francis Osnowitz's puppets. So there's some pictures of them there, because they were big puppeteers in San Francisco, but they had also had some puppets from before when they were in Europe. A really interesting story. So you can look that up and learn about that.
okay, so here we are in Driscoll Park, formerly Magruder Park, and I think Joe is going to figure out a place to turn around. When Hyattsville decided to honor Jim with a sculpture, they did it as a bas-relief, and you can see all of these were originally done in clay, and Mr. Culbertson, the sculptor, sort of took things from Sam and Friends scenes. This is from Pun Smoke, and here's Huntley Brinkley, or he took group shots, and all of these were sculpted in clay and eventually cast in concrete or cement, and all brought here. And that flatbed truck had to probably turn around the same way that we're doing now. Now the planter that we're going to be seeing is surrounded by these stone benches, each of which has a Henson quote, Henson-related quote on it. Just a couple of months ago, they added some nice signage to identify the location, because the installation was put in without any real identifying marks. So what we're going to do, our first stop will be the meal hall, and then we'll go on to the stand. But I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for joining us, and to thank Heather. This was all her idea to do. And thank you, Cheryl, for being with us. And Theo for making sure the video worked. And a very special thank you to Joe for getting us all around. Joe was amazing because he went out and drove the route a couple times to make sure everything was going to work. And thank you for getting in touch with the University Park Police Department. So this is the dining hall. So if people are getting off at the dining hall, this is where you get off.
Many thanks to Craig Shemin and Heather Henson for allowing me to release this audio to you. Thanks also to Cheryl Henson and the National Puppetry Festival. Craig and Heather asked that I share a link to an article on toughpigs.com that has a detailed description of the tour along with some photos from the day. You'll find that link along with some photos I took on the tour in the show notes for this episode number 96, over at underthepuppet.com. I'd like to send a special thank you out to all the Saturday Morning Media Patreon patrons who help make this show possible. Patreon patrons at the producer level and above who get a special shout out are Eve Cunning, Kathy Crawford, Tony Urbano, Brandy, David Akers, Paul, Scott Armstrong, Vicky Sebring, Ricky Chavez, and Karina. To become a patron, visit patreon.com/Saturday Morning Media. And thank you for your support. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Under the Puppet. If you have any questions, suggestions, or feedback about the show, call our voicemail line at 818-806-9604. Or click the Call the Show button in the free Under the Puppet app for iOS and Android. You can also send feedback via email to underthepuppet@gmail.com. And you can connect with the show on Instagram or Facebook by searching for Under the Puppet. And don't forget to share your favorite episode with a friend. This episode featured music by Dan Ring and was incredibly expertly edited by Steven Staver. Thank you so much for listening. Under the Puppet is copyright 2024 Saturday Morning Media Grant Pachoco executive producer, all rights reserved. www.saturdaymorningmedia.com. Under the Puppet proudly presents The Adventures of Timmy the Tooth Reunion. In this almost 90-minute video, you will hear great stories from the cast and crew who brought this amazing puppet show to life. Plus, you'll see never-before-seen artwork and exclusive behind-the-scenes video. Under the Puppet's Timmy the Tooth Reunion is available right now at timmy.underthepuppet.com. You've been listening to Saturday Morning Media. Stay tuned, we'll be right back.